What's cracking, guys? So welcome to today's episode. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Marc Morris, and we are going to be chatting about nutrition information, specifically the transmission of information. I think this is a big area where, coaches and people kind of struggle with because, we hear a lot of conflicting beliefs conflicting opinions. And a lot of it is just kind of lacking context. And so that's one of the things that Marc is actually fantastic at. If you check out his page, he's really, really great at disseminating information in a very simple and easy to understand way. So before we get into it, as always, if you enjoy the podcast, make sure you smash the subscribe button and pay it forward by sending it to a friend that you think would enjoy or needs to hear this information. So Marc, thanks so much for joining us, man. I'm really excited to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to have this opportunity and excited to talk shop today.
Cool, man. So can you introduce yourself to maybe some of the people who aren't familiar with who you are?
You betcha. My name is Marc Morris. I've been an online nutrition and strength coach for the last 10 years. It was one of those, I think I have a similar story to a lot of people where grew up playing high school sports, realized that I needed to lift weights to get better at those sports, discovered that I liked you could actually just lift weights competitively, and just started to focus on that. Applied to, university because I was admittedly wanted to go to do some science-based stuff. Went to university, didn't really love what I was studying in terms of analytical chemistry and that type of stuff, but just spent so much time in the gym and have been trying to bridge the gap between the science of lifting weights and nutrition and resistance training and making it practical and applicable since that time. And I went through the path of going to grad school for completing my PhD in human nutrition and trying to pair that with applying that stuff to individuals and how we get results and stuff that was really lighting me up and firing me up inside and trying to do that. And I remember a few things competing in bodybuilding and powerlifting and coaching in powerlifting at different levels. I just remember my first bodybuilding show being in the back room of a pump up room and watching someone eat a raw potato and thinking there's more to this than that. There's something is missing here in terms of why this individual is doing this. And we've misled them somewhere along the way. So I think since that time, I've been just trying to figure this whole thing out and teach people what I know.
Awesome. And yeah, I first met you at the Strength Symposium. I don't remember what year that was, a couple of years ago in Edmonton.
You betcha.
Andrew put on. It was actually a really awesome talk. And so I think we kind of stay connected ever since, actually.
You bet. We bonded over a few things. And one of those things was, well, obviously we have an interest in powerlifting and weight class sports and the nutrition component that goes along with that. But we were talking after, and I remember we chatted about, we had both done the Stanford Writing in the Sciences course. I don't remember that. I remember me saying one of my actual all-time favorite learning experiences was this free course I did that was just blew me out of the water. No one had taught me to write like that or communicate like that. And you were like, I've done that course. And I was like, this is the coolest thing. Cause usually I mention it and no one else knew about it, but just completely free learning opportunity.
It's so crazy how many free courses they have that people don't know about. Yeah, it's honestly bananas. To be honest, I actually forgot about that. I'm gonna have to revisit some of that. So yeah, man, thanks for the reminder.
My own program, I've actually built a lot of, for nutrition coaches, I've built a lot of it off that learning experience, just making it really applicable and applied. And I remember as you're going through the exercise in that course, you write things that you can use in other areas and stuff. And just a really cool learning opportunity because a lot of times you're just jumping through hoops in a lot of those experiences, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny actually, because I find that writing has made me a significantly better coach because it really forces you to be concise with your words. Even I found the other day, I commented on one of my buddy's posts and I wasn't even thinking about it. And then I get this slew of people just coming at me. And I was like, what is going on? And then I remember reading my post and what I wrote was accurate, but I left out a freaking critical component that if it's not there, everything that I said is 100% wrong. And so I was like, oh my God, how could I, and I don't go on Facebook ever. And so it was just, I checked it, I made a little thing. And I was like, man, so it's so important because when you write, you put it out there and people are going to come at you because it's there, it's set in stone. And so you really, really have to be diligent about, effective communication, using caveats, applying the right kind of context. So I found for myself anyways, it's definitely made me a much stronger communicator, because I'm way, way more cautious about what I say now, just because you're going to get lambasted by all the people out there. Yeah, so it's been kind of a cool experience as well.
Totally. I think it kind of like spills into this conversation around
100%.
language mattering, and thinking about, who we're speaking to, who's going to access information most of the time, right? I think a lot of times we think of, thinking of a sea of people that could hear and see this stuff. It can be somewhat daunting, but who's behind our message, who needs to hear it, who's going to benefit from it, and crafting a story around them. And I think that's what, a lot of nutrition educators miss at times, is that they're teaching and educating on what they know, and that misses the target audience of who would really benefit from that information, or at least who they're attempting to attract.
Yeah, no, 100%. And you know what? It's really funny actually, because I've had a couple people reach out to me and be like, just kind of talking about some of the content that I put out. And they're like, "Oh yeah, you put out great content for coaches." And I'm like, "For coaches?" I was like, "That's not who I'm trying to." And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, "Fuck, I'm an idiot. I'm writing about what's interesting to me." And so I've been changing slightly what I'm writing, or at least how I'm delivering it. And it's so funny because sometimes you lose that connection to where where you started. Like even something as simple as like saying strength is a skill, right? You understand that, I understand that, but the depth of understanding there is completely different than someone who hears it and hears strength as a skill. They're like, I don't even understand what that means. You know what I mean? It
Exactly.
doesn't even really make sense until you understand the different components of strength, right?
Totally.
And so it's like something seemingly so simple that you just kind of take for granted can be completely over someone's head, and you just completely are unaware of it because you've been in the game for so long.
Completely.
Which kind of brings us actually to the first question that I wanted to ask you. Like nutrition, a lot of these things are pretty simple at face value. And like when you look at a lot of the really, really effective behaviors, it's honestly way simpler than people seem to think. But it can be pretty complicated, especially with all the information out there and like what people really emphasize, depending on where you're getting your information from. So how do you go about kind of not only starting that dialogue, but finding out where an individual is, and then kind of meeting them at that level, without kind of seeming like you're condescending to them, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times that's a really good question. A lot of times when we create content or try to educate, I think we always got to take it from the lens of we're trying to motivate someone to take action around a lot of these things, because the typical viewer or someone that wants to learn more about this stuff is typically after a specific result. Like they want, and this is where conventional fitness marketing has worked for the longest time, is that is like aspirational. You're showing the end result of something. And it's got to the point where people sell things that are almost completely unrelated to what they're talking about, right? Like you think about like, buff dude on the front of a magazine holding a supplement container. And it's like, this really didn't happen like this, but it's aspirational. It gets people thinking. It's like, I want to look like that. I need this thing. So I think we got to take it from the lens of what does the end viewer want? And a lot of times it's a specific result. And if we can kind of frame the conversation around, you want this thing, here's what you want, here's what is important and why it is important, and chatting about that without going too far into the how, we open up an entire world of possibility, especially around our coaching. And I think a lot of times people approach these subjects and try to give everything away by providing value and stuff, when in reality, we should get people interested in what we're doing for them to take the next step. So that's a lot of times like kind of what I teach and try to get people interested in, is because sometimes it's just way too much information for people to digest. And a lot of times, like what you're saying in terms of the anecdote of your story, it's like, that makes a lot of sense, because you are not your market, and what interests you is not going to be the same thing that captivates, the average gym goer or someone just getting into this, because they're not at the same level. And a lot of times we take that lens and it misleads us in our content and what we're trying to put out there, because we're not attracting the right person. And sometimes you can see it in the comments section of an Instagram post, like who is nodding their head at this, right? Is it the people you want to attract? Is it like someone saying like, holy, like, that's me. You just like completely, summarize my situation. Or is it another coach that's like, this is great information, which is kind of off base if what you're trying to do and attract is people that need to get started on their fitness journey. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and you said something there that that I think is really, really important. And this is kind of difficult because I think a lot of the times it goes over people's heads. It certainly does for me a lot of the times, and that's motivating someone to take action, because it's really easy to put content out there, but then it's like, okay, what do you actually do with it? Like, if you're writing an article, are you just putting out information, or are you saying, hey, here's what's going on here, here's some things you can do to maybe mediate the effects of a decreased energy expenditure as you're dieting, or here's some issues that a lot of people have in terms of experiencing pain in the shoulder when you're bench pressing. Here's what you do about that. And I think that
Yeah.
second piece is it's really easy to forget. Like, even
Yeah.
myself, I have to constantly be reminding myself, like, hey, how is this piece of content actionable?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Are you actually giving someone a solution, or are you just telling them things with no sort of anchor?
Completely.
So I really, really like how you mentioned that.
Well, I think a lot of times one of the best things you can do, and I think a lot of times a lot of people that are going to be listening to this podcast and are interested in this stuff are going to be science-based, evidence-based coaches that, want to learn more about what the truth is and what truly gets results, and like the logic around this stuff and all of that stuff, which is great. But sometimes that spills into our content, right? Sometimes we think, just because I operate this way in my practice, I now need to talk about that stuff. And in reality, like, it doesn't always need to be like that. There's probably room for some of your content to be around that, but also like illustrative storytelling in terms of, let me tell you about an individual that was just like you, that was looking to get leaner, that, wanted to lose fat and struggled with the impacts or the, adaptations to their metabolism as they did this process, and kind of how it ended up. Right. And it's like, that's almost like it's a more of a cautionary tale as opposed to what does the data say. And there's just like a lot of good examples in pop culture around like people that are using data to create stories and tell stories. Like, I always think of like the Malcolm Gladwell books, where it's like, this is an interpretation of the data and stories built around that, as opposed to, like, if your content reads like a literature review, like it's not going to be, it probably won't hit the right market that you're after.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that, I mean, all of these things are literally mistakes I have made.
You're not. I come to this not being. I come to it because I'm still trying to figure it out too. It's not like coming from a place where it's like, I got this figured out. You start to see it, and you start to see where, like, much to the chagrin of a lot of like experienced coaches that got to where they are because they've just spent enough time doing it, developed, you know, supporters and a track record of results, that see new individuals coming in that are just like telling stories and showing the end result and being like, why are they doing this? They're getting clients, they're coaching people. I'm kind of pissed off about it. It's like, they're doing what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's really interesting because, like, I know when I was starting out as a coach, I didn't know any fucking thing really. And
Yeah.
so I would read a lot, and I still read a lot, and it's a big part of my job is research or whatever. But like, I think that sometimes it's easy to fall into the trap of learn, 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 and then lacking the application. And if you don't have a PhD, if you don't have an RD, a master, something like that, it's very easy to be like, I want to qualify myself, and therefore I need to sound smart. I need to, use technical jargon. I need to communicate these things very clearly and concisely to people who know what I'm talking about, but then completely baffle people who actually need the information. Like, I don't need to tell you about energy deficits or anything like that if you want to lose weight. You already know it. So communicating that to other people in the same way I talk to you is a bit ridiculous. And I find that even still to this day, I will say something and I'll still have people be like, oh, what's that? And I'm like, oh shit, yeah, okay, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's difficult. It's difficult, especially being online too, because I talk to my clients a lot, like probably 5 to 10 times a week, but it's via text, and it's usually not about a lot of those things. And so if you lack that one-on-one kind of interaction like you maybe get in person when you're training someone, I think it can be really easy to kind of disassociate from the other person. Does that make sense? You
Yeah.
know, so one thing that I wanted to ask as well actually is about promoting client autonomy and self-efficacy, because that's obviously a really, really huge thing. And there's like a lot that goes into it, including education and, you know, homework and behavior change. And so how do you go about developing that from a coach helping a client, but then also if you're just an individual who's looking to make this change for yourself, what are some things that you can do to take some of those steps in the right direction?
Well, that's a great question. And one thing I constantly find myself repeating and talking about, especially when I'm training other coaches, and this is a piece of advice that was given to me by a social work friend. And she said, one thing that we try to do in social work is not do anything for a client or patients that they couldn't do for themselves. And that like hit me like, because I think as people that are passionate about this stuff, we always want to help. We always want to do more. We always want to go the extra mile. And a lot of times it becomes so prescriptive or so hand holding that we actually prevent people from developing the habits and taking the steps that they need to do this stuff on their own. And I think that's always the ultimate goal, is to be able to release someone into the wild and for them to be able to navigate this stuff on their own. There's also a common misconception that, you know, these clients or people can't come back, because there's some accountability and guidance that goes along with this stuff. But I think your goal as a coach is always to put someone in a place where the ownership is on them. They're developing these habits. The kind of buck stops with them, and you're not hand holding them to the part where it's going to be, it's going to be destructive or impede them from reaching their long-term goals or developing the habits that allow them to do this stuff for longer than the relationship with you. So I remember always that being, something that was important. And how that looks from a coaching perspective, a lot of times is, let's say we're doing like a weekly check-in. We're assessing the way things look, getting feedback, getting a better sense of where the client is, some positive reinforcement in terms of what's going well, maybe some action steps in terms of what needs to change or being addressed. But the motivational interviewing side of things being like, here's what I think is prescriptive and what you should do. How likely are you to do it? Or what would this look like to you in a way that's reasonable, and getting them involved in the solution is probably the best place. Now that's like on your own without support, and trying to objectively assess that within yourself, very tough to do, almost nearly impossible. And I don't know any real sane person that tries to do that themselves. Not to say that people are crazy, but maybe they just don't know what they don't know yet in terms of that. I know a lot of people, there's a reason why you have a coach. There's a reason why I get coaches. There's a reason why we have someone else objectively looking at their stuff, because it's just tough to do. So I think getting them involved in the solution while still trying to be prescriptive is the right mix of having an authority, being the expert, leading someone down the path, but also getting them involved in the solution.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I absolutely love what you said about the story with the social worker, because it's so goddamn relevant. Like, I wrote an article a couple of years ago, and I think it was called like "Good Coaches Keep Their Clients Accountable, Great Coaches Don't."
Mm-hmm.
And it was literally exactly that. And the reason why I wrote that was because I actually had an incident many, many years before that, where this was back when I was training people in person. And I remember I told one of my clients to load up, to work up to a certain percentage of their weight or whatever. And they were like, "How much is that?" And I'm like, "Well, just calculate it." And they're like, "I don't know what my 1RM is." And I was like, what the fuck? And I was like, I am the worst coach ever, because I would load their weights for them a lot of the times. And I would be writing stuff on my tablet, so I was knowing exactly what they're doing at the time. And I didn't even realize that, like I said, like exactly like you said, I was completely incapacitating them and like making sure that they had zero understanding of what they were doing, why they were doing any of that stuff. And I just thought I was being a coach. And right after that moment, I was like, I refuse to load anyone's weight. I refuse to hold anyone's program. If you don't bring your program, you're going home, getting your phone, and finding a way to find your like. I refuse to do that now. And one, it saves me a ton of work. But then two, now they actually benefit from it. And they're like, "Oh no, I know how much 70% is, or I know exactly this, or I know exactly that," because it's like you're forcing them to do it instead of just like doing their homework for them. And so like that's something that has 100% stuck with me because so I freaking love that you had that story as well.
Well,
Um,
it makes it's so tough to do because we come from a place of wanting to help. Like it's not coming from a place where, you know, you're trying to set people back or not set them up for success. You're doing it with the right intentions. It's just
yeah.
it really does start to impact things when it goes too far. So just like anything else, there's a right balance of being prescriptive and helpful and guiding people down the right path, but also acknowledging that if we do too much of it for them, it just comes a time where, you know, it doesn't even mean when you're not working with them. It can mean when they're in a situation where they got to think critically or have a decision to make, or, you know, it's that stuff where you're just trying to enable them to be able to navigate those situations.
Yeah, 100%. And like right now I'm actually working on an article on like why dietary interventions have such a high failure rate,
Mm-hmm.
which actually is a little bit of a misnomer because they actually don't. The vast majority of dietary interventions work. It's just when you extrapolate it out 3 5 years and so on, that's usually when it ends up failing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much that goes into behavior that it's actually crazy. And like one of the things that I would love to hear is how you help a client create more awareness around their eating behaviors, right? Because it's like, I know for myself, for instance, the more that I started reading up on like trauma and cue reactivity and like your response to, you know, emotional situations or stressful situations, and I started looking at my eating behavior, I was like, oh my God, like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of my negative eating habits are really triggered by either trauma, you know, or not like trauma now, but just I have PTSD, right? And so like,
Sure.
you know, past issues and then triggered by certain stressful situations and things like that. And then I know, like, when I created that awareness, I was like, oh, this is why I'm feeling that way. You
Exactly.
know, and it really allowed me to like take ownership of it and then
Mm-hmm.
see, you know, start steering myself in the right direction. And that was such a huge piece for me. So I would love to hear how you go about doing that with your clients.
I think you hit a lot of key points there. I think the biggest thing around any dietary intervention and why, you know, numerous like different diets, be it focusing on different things and macronutrients or different approaches, are successful is because you're just being more mindful of what you're eating. And I think you were able to create the awareness around, hey, there's a situation I get into that completely derails my nutritional habits and what I eat. And it's because of this certain thing. And you created, you know, that awareness around it, that this impacts things. And I think that in itself is like the power of just being more mindful of what is going on. First of all, like eating and like eating is a valid coping strategy. So it's always one of those things where that's not necessarily wrong. It's just the reaction to what you're doing, right? So like we just always got to think about that too. But at the same time, it's just this stuff is an awareness thing. It really is, and that's why most dietary interventions, while you're still being mindful of that stuff, will work. It's when you resume and aren't in that situation, or you know, are thrown into a different situation where you'll resort to old habits or go back to the old things. One thing that's always interesting to me is during my PhD, the college that I worked in was one of the only nutrition colleges I'm aware of, but in Canada where it's a college of pharmacy and nutrition. So they train pharmacists and nutritionists, or dietitians, although they're in the same college. It's two separate colleges, but we discuss research and everything's under the same umbrella. And they have like a lot of research around adherence to pharmaceutical interventions. Like that's a big area of research, which thinking of nutrition and medical interventions is is quite different, because a lot of times we're talking about like, you know, taking a pill, adhering to taking this sort of medication, be it like diabetes medication, whatever it is. And like the rates around that stuff in terms of adherence, be it whatever barrier it is, people can't get their medication, they forget, whatever stuff like that. It's 80% around like a pill. So you start to think about, we got all these, you know, kind of abstract nutrition concepts to think about and adhere to. You're talking about like a much more complicated process. So trying to simplify it in any way you can in terms of, here are the key parameters, here's a structure to be able to follow, let me educate you within this structure in terms of what are the expectations, as well as what are the habits that are going to allow you to meet that structure, is like the best thing that you can do to set people up for success, while also knowing that like good is what we're after, and not perfection, because you'll never live up to that. It's just, we're trying to be as accurate as we can be in a somewhat inaccurate science. So that's my that's my take around that.
No, 100%. And I made a post about this actually, I think yesterday. Um, I gave two examples of different situations. It was like, person number one's a professional athlete, trains 6 times a week, sleeps 9 to 10 hours a day, has a perfect supplementation nutrient timing strategy. Person B, full-time in school, part-time job, sleeps 5 to 6 hours a day, yada, 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 trains 3 times a week. Both situations are optimal.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think there's sometimes a bit of a disconnect between theoretical optimal and practical. And practical is seen a lot of the times as regression, or not trying hard enough, or not wanting it bad enough a lot of times. And it's like, I've noticed that my tendency, and I think a lot of people who are serious about the results have a bias towards doing way too much,
Completely.
too much volume, too much intensity, not taking enough time to rest. They're always pushing, pushing, pushing. When what they really need to do is just like sit back and be like, hey, shut the fuck up. And just like, look at what's actually happening. Like, your back feels like it's going to explode. Is this a mental toughness thing? Do you really think that you need to be tougher and just push through it? Or should you maybe just be like, hey, I don't know if I want to die. I'm going to, sit this one out for a little bit.
Totally. I always think about, like, for example, prescribing some macronutrients targets. I remember like a few key examples where I'd be starting to work with a client, like a vegan client, for example, and they're getting into resistance training and they want to recover and they want to optimize their body composition. And they've heard everything under the sun about their protein intake and how it might be harder for them to get up to some of these quote unquote optimal levels. And we'll do like a 5-day dietary assessment on them. And let's say this female is like 70 kilos and is getting into resistance training. And we think, okay, optimal levels of protein intake, if she's eating mostly plant-based sources, like maybe there's an argument for being a little bit, like maybe even eating a bit more because the quality is a little bit different. Maybe we put her around like 2.0 grams per kilogram of protein. We're talking 150 grams of protein a day. We do an assessment on her, see what her current habits are like and what she's currently eating. And she's eating like 65 grams of protein per day. For you to try to make the leap and bound to what is quote unquote optimal is not setting anyone up for success. Like, optimal for this individual is like, we're adding in a few more sources and trying to maybe, increase the serving sizes of the protein you're already eating and aiming for 90 grams of protein or 85 grams of protein, something realistic for us to bridge the gap between where you are now and where quote unquote optimal could be. And a lot of times what happens with that individual is they don't have the right guidance and support, or someone's coaching them that just isn't realistic about that, is that the first recommendation or whatever it is, the bias or whatever it is just way too much that they'll never be able to do it. And it actually ends up backfiring on them in terms of what could be 85 grams of protein and could be beneficial and more, and moving towards optimal is now like, I'm not eating any protein sources at all. And because, I just can't keep up with this. I can't do that. Right. And it's like, that's where people make absolutely zero progress. So it's like, science is just so incredible because it's given us a way to create results that are reproducible and repeatable, and methods and strategies. But we also need to incorporate the art of this stuff and think, what is actually optimal for this individual? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, 100%, man. And there's kind of two things actually that I want to piggyback on. The first thing is, I think people really underestimate the ramping effect that you get to kind of build up that momentum. And especially with nutrition, this is something I think a lot of people struggle with. I definitely know that I've struggled with it because, like, let's say your diet is absolute dog shit. It's the worst it could possibly be. Mm-hmm. And let's just say hypothetically that you need to reach roughly 80% adherence or so before you actually start seeing some meaningful results. So it's like, okay, you go from zero diet to maybe 20% adherent, and that's hard, right? And then you're not seeing any results. And then maybe over the next 2 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever, you get up to 60% adherent, still no results. And now you're putting in way more work. Another month passes, and let's say we've done, 2 or 3 months, and sometimes this legitimately happens. After 3 months, you're about 78% adherence. You're not quite at that point yet. And this is obviously hypothetical.
Yep.
but so you haven't really seen any meaningful results, and you've been putting in all this work, and people don't see a lot of the underlying changes through your behavior, your habits. Like, what does your food actually look like now? Look at your awareness. Look at how you're strategizing for your day and pre-planning. Look at all of the things you're doing. And then all they need to do is just kind of keep going and pushing that little extra bit further, and they would start seeing the results. But then they give up because they're like, man, I put all this work, it must be bullshit. And it's like, for me, I totally understand that, because
Completely.
I've been there, and a lot of people obviously have been there. But I think that it's due to a lack of understanding of that ramping effect and how things can kind of progress on that. And the second thing is repeating myself. A lot of the times I will have the same conversations over and over and over again with my athletes, whether they're brand new or elite or whatever. This is nutrition, training, whatever. Like, if I'm cueing an athlete, I'll be like, oh, load, like, wedge your hips in. You got to stay tighter, be more patient off the ground. And they're like, oh, I keep doing this, and you keep telling me the same thing. And I always have to tell them, like, hey, look, I tell like super high level athletes the same thing, right? It's just that you need to hear the same thing over and over and over, and it needs to be reinforced over and over and over until eventually you get it, right?
And it
We're
clicks,
over
right?
here,
You can
and now
see
you're
the
moving
light bulb
further along
effect
the
a lot.
spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, so I always have to kind of talk to people and be like, it's a spectrum. Technique is not an on-off switch. Dieting is not an on-off switch. It's a spectrum. And you have been over here, and now you're progressively moving over to that, hypothetical optimal that we've been talking about. And again, it's really difficult to kind of understand that when, in practice, you're not necessarily seeing a lot of the tangible results, which is why I know you track a lot of behaviors. I like to track behaviors as well, because I think that's a fantastic way to demonstrate progress that's, let's just say, not measured on the scale or whatever.
Yeah.
And be like, hey, look, you're getting this much protein. Like you said, you weren't getting 150, but you were only getting 40. Now, over the last week, we've seen you've increased your protein intake every single week over week, by about 15 to 20 grams consistently. Yeah. Where do you think you're going to be in 2 months? Exactly where you want to be.
For sure.
Right.
Yeah. It's like maybe you came to me in a situation for a specific body composition goal, but you've also expressed that, like, you're recovering from training much better. You're noticing improvements in your strength. You feel this, your posture's improved. Like, the coaching, the job of a coach is to reinforce some of those other behaviors too. And not to pump people's tires, but there's always going to be stuff like that we need to highlight and talk about, because it all adds up and moves people in the right direction. And then before you know it, they've done enough of those things that they wake up one day 6-8 months later and they're in a completely different situation, but they never really noticed it. Right. And I think one of the most powerful things is that right now, culturally, pretty difficult time. We're like living through this, like, a situation that most of us haven't. It's just strange. Our lives are different. A lot of people don't like to think about the progress they made in spite of what was going on. They compare it to this somewhat, unrealistic expectation they have of themselves of what would be perfect and what would happen when things are perfect. I would never let this filter into a marketing message, because it's not all that smart. But it's like, hey, listen, this individual that was working with me, like, maybe you set out in this journey to lose 10 pounds and you've only lost 2 in the last 5 months. But no one likes to compare where you would like to be if you hadn't done any of this stuff, which is you probably would have gained 10 pounds. Realistically, no one likes to compare to that. Who would want to do that, right? It's not the optimal situation of what we'd have, but that is like the reality of this stuff, is that, like, that is progress, that is meaningful, that is you moving in the right direction. And maybe it isn't perfect, but it's quality, and it's going to help you in the long term.
Yeah, 100%. And a lot of the times too, I think people get a little bit caught up with kind of the recency bias. So prime example is I have an athlete competing this weekend. She's had an absolutely stellar prep, and she's hitting like just insane numbers in the gym. She's had a couple of days, like I'm talking like maybe 3 or 4 days over the last like 12, 16 weeks, where she, in her opinion, she underperformed. In my opinion, she didn't, because we're utilizing RPE. And so that was what she needed to do on that day. But she underperformed based on her own expectations for herself. And so it's like, we've got all of this productive training, and then on the day, oh, I had a bad day. Oh my God. Like, I don't know if I'm going to be ready to compete.
Is this peak ruined? Is it like, am I going to be able to? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, dude, what do you do you think one day is going to ruin the last 4 months of training? You know what I
Totally.
mean? And the thing is, they do. 100%
Yeah.
they do. And I've been in that situation where I'll fuck up and I'm like, oh my God, and it's like exactly like you said, I'm a coach. I have a coach for that exact reason. So I don't want to stress about this shit, you know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, because we're human and we have stupid biases and we do stupid things. So,
For sure. Well, and I mean, you see the athletes that learn to manage that stuff, and they're just like a lot more stoic about the process. It's like
yeah.
these real good days doesn't really matter. These real bad days, it is what it is. Like it's just a lot more neutral, and they've realized that just being productive over longer periods of time is what pushes the needle in all of this stuff, right? That's what shifts the baseline. That's what allows us to get better, and that's what good coaching will allow you to do. Is just like, you know, kind of temper a lot of those expectations and keep things moving in the right direction.
Yeah, no, 100%. And so when a client is sort of clinging on to like, destructive or potentially destructive, maybe ideologies or approaches that they really, really believe,
Mm-hmm.
how do you go about navigating that conversation? Because that's difficult. You obviously don't want to come out and be like, "No, you're wrong. You're an idiot, and that's why you're not losing weight." But then at the same time, there needs to be a certain level of validation, but you have to also correct them. Like, how
Yeah.
do you navigate that conversation? Because people really, really cling to those beliefs.
Totally. I have a bit of a different approach to this, and I think it surprises people a lot of times. I wrote an email 2 weeks ago that had like an open rate that was like 85% or something. And the subject line was why everyone should cut weight for the first powerlifting meet. And I knew by writing that people are like, what is it like? What is he talking about? This is like go like flies in the face of
Yeah.
all conventional powerlifting advice based on what everyone says, right? And I think it comes from a place where people have longstanding beliefs. They want to do certain things. As a coach, my belief in a lot of these situations is that like I'm a harm reductionist. People are going to do things that they're going to do regardless. If someone asks me if they should be going keto, they're not looking for my opinion. They're looking for validation. If someone asks me if they should be cutting weight for this next powerlifting meet coming up, a lot of times they're doing it with or without me. And it's a bit different when you have a client that you've been working with for a long-standing period of time that you've built up a rapport and stuff. But a lot of times these are conversations that we have with people that are looking to us for validation and advice. And a lot of times, in my experience, the best thing you can do to support them is help them navigate those things that they're going to do with or without you in the best possible way you can, incorporating the evidence that we know is going to be helpful, and let them come to their own conclusions around a lot of this stuff. Because I've had a lot of people that will quote unquote cut weight for their first powerlifting meet, feel like complete dog shit, realize that this isn't the way that they want to navigate their powerlifting career. And then they're like, tell me what I need to do. Okay, I get it. I get it now. Right. Which to me is like, that's what's building resilient people. And that is what allows people to like truly make change in their lives, is that they've experienced that thing. And not to say we're enabling them, because a lot of times it's like, hey, listen, I don't think you should do this, but I understand if you want to. And here's the scenario. Here are the things that could happen. If you still want to do it, I totally get it. I want to put you in a position to be successful. Reminder, I don't think you should, but here's what we'll do. Here's what it looks like. This is the stuff. So to me, it's like reinforcing and clearly communicating that, yeah, maybe this isn't optimal and it isn't what you want to do, but we all have those things. We do. We're lying if we don't. Like we do. We all have our biases and things that like aren't really doing us any favors. And the best way to face them a lot of times is to put ourselves in situations where we need to face them and talk about them and learn from our mistakes. So that's kind of my take on that, is that like, I think a lot of times being too prescriptive and preachy and saying you can't do this or do that just turns people off from doing the things that they're going to do it with or without you. So a lot of times if we can help them work through that stuff and give them the best support as they're doing it, a lot of times they come out on the other side thinking like, yep, that was okay. I kind of want to do it your way now. And you're like, cool.
Yeah, I can really see how that would be a solid approach to take for a couple reasons. I mean, like one, you're validating them. 2, you're saying, hey, here's what I think is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3, exactly what you say is going to happen usually happens. And then they're like, oh, okay, he was supportive the whole time. He wasn't a dick about it. He let me do it and try it my way. And he warned me about this, but he still guided me. So now, yeah, exactly like you said. Now it's like, okay, now I've got a lot of trust. I've got a lot of confidence in him,
Yeah.
or her, or whatever. But
Yeah.
no, I think that's a really interesting approach. I did that once, and I actually did have a pretty good experience. So I don't generally coach like weight loss clients,
Mm-hmm.
really. Not that I don't do it. It's just I don't generally have people coming specifically for weight loss. A
Yeah.
lot of the times they're like strength athletes or something like that, and the strength athletes, they'll have body composition related goals, but it's not their primary goal. So
Right.
I guess that case would be like, I want to cut 12 pounds this month, and I'm like, okay, we can do that, but your
Mm-hmm.
strength is going to really take a hit. And then they'll be like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And I'm like, all right, sure. And so, let's go. You got a high level of motivation. Let's do it. Let's
Yeah.
see if we can make some capital gains or whatever. And then, or not capital gains. Let's see if we can, I don't know where.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. It's
let's
like
see if
you're
we can
gonna
make,
be taxed on that, buddy.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can make some progress. I'm thinking of one individual in particular. So we did a cut just like they wanted to. Their strength went to shit. They couldn't even hit what they were doing like before for 5s at an RPE
Mm-hmm.
7 or something like that. They were missing a bunch of the weights. They felt like shit. The recovery wasn't great. And they were just kind of really stressed out. Sleep was not, you know what I mean? So I just kept having to reduce the training load to accommodate. And then eventually they were just like, after about 4 weeks, they were like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I was like, yeah, it sucks, doesn't it? I
It
was like,
does. Yeah, exactly.
this is something that we do in the off season. This is not something that we do before a competition.
Mm-hmm.
And oh yeah, that was one of the big things. They were wanting to cut into a competition. I was like, that is not a good idea, man. As a competition is a time to be, in a slight surplus or maintenance. Like you don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
For this person anyways, right? I
Right.
understand
Yeah.
dieting for some other individuals, but in this particular context, it wasn't a great idea. But yeah, 100% exactly like you said, had the exact effect that I was looking for. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Because that's
Yep.
not something that you would normally think about doing, right? Like it's not really intuitive.
Yeah. No, it isn't. And I think a lot of times using the science, like the scientific method and the body of evidence, just allows us to, like, informs us of some decisions, but then the art of this stuff is just using it in creative ways that gets people to adhere and moves them in the right direction. And that to me is the exciting part of all of this stuff, is that, like, at the end of the day, it's about moving people in the right direction. So what we need to do to get there is kind of up to the coach and the situation and what we do. And I like that stuff is like one example of that is I always remember a few situations where, clients were like, I need to calorie cycle. Like this is what works for me. And I'm like, honestly, I don't think you do. You're training 3 times a week. Like this makes no sense. And they're like, no, I need to do it. I was like, okay, let's do it. Phenomenal results. And in past preps, we tried just one level of food and they weren't excited about it. They didn't work hard about it, like that kind of thing. It depends on the situation, and it depends on, where the individual is coming from and what's going to excite them and allow them to stick to things and adhere.
Yeah. And I mean, I think in those instances as well, it's like, if it's not directly going to impede their progress, then even if I don't like it, I'm like, fuck it, let's do it.
Exactly.
And then
Yeah.
exactly like you said, because sometimes people just do have this kind of tendency to want something a little bit more complicated. They're like, I want to do the calorie cycling. I want to do, I want to cycle my carbohydrates. I want to, use nutrient timing strategies.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Like,
And I think of, yeah, I think being an evidence-based practitioner, a lot of times we're thinking like, is this safe? Is this effective? Does it matter? Like if it's probably safe and we're not sure it's going to be effective, like, is this the hill I'm going to die on? Right. Yeah. Like that, like, does it matter kind of thing? It's like kind of working through some of those scenarios so that you give people enough autonomy and buy in the process that they do what they ultimately need to do, which might not be related to those things.
Yeah. So in terms of like prescribing homework or maybe educational resources or material, anything like that, do you do that with any of your clients?
Yeah, a lot of times when I think I'm explaining something that might be new to them or takes some convincing, a lot of times maybe it's like, here's why I think this is important and maybe you should check it out and why we're going to do it, just as like a bit of support and stuff. But I always think, and I talk to a lot of people. I think we started this conversation talking about this. It's like the power is in the application. Like it really is. Like you're going to realize why this stuff works when you see a specific result from it and the reason why we're doing things. Like that to me is always that light bulb moment of, yes, I get it. Right. Someone comes to you and like they have an overly restrictive past and they've yo-yo dieted and they're having a hard time. It's like, I get you don't think you can eat ice cream, but I want you to try it once per week within your calories. Like I want you to go and do it. They're like, oh, I don't know if I can. It's like, believe me, abstaining from this is only going to make it so much more likely that you're going to do it outside of your control sooner than later. So like, why don't you try it? And they're like, okay, my weight didn't go up. I'm still making progress, yada, yada, yada. Like you're a wizard. Right. And it's like, I honestly, a lot of times just the proof is in the actions and the confidence they build through taking action and seeing the positive results of, what they never thought could be true.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, especially like removing some of the stigma from those deeply ingrained beliefs. Like I've had athletes, I'm sure you have as well, where it's like, they're coming to me and they're like, hey, you know what, I have an injury, so I'm really, really hesitant about doing deadlifts. It's like, okay, cool. And they're okay doing all sorts of other things that are literally putting just as much shear force in their spine, and just as much compression, that are much more dangerous, right? And but they have this sort of like fixation on this particular movement. This movement's dangerous.
Yep.
And it's like, how do you get someone out of that? Because the risk for them, exactly like you said, if I eat this food, I risk rebounding up, losing control, right? Like there's such a big risk in their head.
Yeah.
How do you go about that conversation? I mean, I guess you kind of answered it, right? Like just sort of like a graded exposure.
Yeah. I mean, like validation around how they're feeling, because I mean, that's ultimately what matters, right? That's what's going to motivate them to take the next step. Is that like, I get it. I get you don't want to do deadlifts. I understand. Like blowing up your back again and being in a situation like that would be super depressing, and I would hate that for you. But listen, if we go about it this way, in a way that you probably haven't done before, in a way that we're going to ramp up, and we're just going to try it, and if something happens, we'll back off, that kind of thing. Let's just try it. Once you built up that trust and rapport, and it's just that, like, slowly ramping up that exposure where they're the point where they're like, yes, like I'm the world hasn't stopped. The lights are still on. Things are moving in the right direction. Like I can do this. Right. And it's all about buy-in and slowly ramping those things up. And then before you know it, like months have passed and they're just in a much better place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so from a behavioral standpoint, how do you go about kind of delegating those behaviors?
I think it's always stepwise, and it's just like slowly introducing it. I think when talking about like kind of like a check-in process and stuff, it's one of those things where here's my suggestion. How likely is this to happen? How does this make you feel? Are you going to be able to do this? If you can't do this, what would it look like for you to incorporate some element of it? Is it frequency? Is it intensity? Is it less? Is it more? Like, what is that thing? Right. And then it opens a conversation to get them involved. And I think a lot of times, you're talking to your people 5 or 10 times a week. A lot of times this stuff is all about having conversations to get people where we need them to go. So I think it's just some buy-in around what the homework is, what the action step is, making sure that there is always an action step so that it's clear, and the expectations of what's expected to them is really, really clear. And then kind of going from there would be the biggest thing. From week to week, following up on those things, making sure that you're talking about it again and not just like brushing it under the rug. And it's like a focal point, right? That's what adherence to this stuff is all about. And that's where, we're finding my entire process is all about creating structure and then creating the habits to fill that structure. You can't have one or the other. And I know in the nutrition world, a lot of certifications will focus on one or the other. Like, here's the science of nutrition. This is all that matters. It's really objective, and it's kind of, I don't know, almost cold and hard to apply. Whereas like, I think it's just some buy-in around what the you go too far down the habit-based path, and it's really hard to get a sense of what people need to do and what's expected of them. And sometimes the results suffer, and they might be in a better place, but they're not all that bought in because they haven't seen the positive payoffs of focusing on this stuff, right? So we almost got to find a balance of the two in terms of, this is what's expected of you, this is what it would look like, this is what good adherence would look like, this is what bad adherence would look like, comparing the two, talking about it, not being, not being negative about it, but just getting a sense of, this is better, this is worse, this is what it looks like, as well as, okay, now that we know what that looks like, how do we fill that and take action steps to actually get there? So it's always a combination of those two things. And if you have one or without the other, like, something's going to suffer.
Right. Awesome, man. So we're kind of coming up on that hour mark, and I want to be respectful of your time. So where can people find you?
You betcha. I'm pretty active on my Instagram account, which is Marc W. Morris, MARC W. Morris. Got quite a bit of information on the drmarkmethod.com, which is my nutrition certification program. So people can check out more information on that. And this stuff is all about talking shop and chatting with people about, what's going on in their lives, what they want to do. So if anyone ever wants to reach out and schedule a call or talk or get some more information, I'm happy to do that. But that would be the best way to reach me and get a better sense of what I do and what I'm all about.
Awesome, man. So all that stuff's can be linked up in the show notes, guys. Definitely make sure you go give him a follow. He's got a lot of great content he puts out on the regular. Marc, thanks so much for jumping on, man. It was a really great chat.
Likewise, I'm grateful for the opportunity.